know, the war between the Apache and the Comanche was one of the bloodiest and longest-lasting in Native American history. They were mortal adversaries and fought in what the Spanish and the Mexicans considered a fight to the finish. The Eastern Apache became the dominant group in the southern Great Plains by the end of the 15th century. They were able to farm in the area and also hunt buffalo on the land they were given. It combined the greatest features of both urban and rural settings. The Comanche were pushed into a disadvantageous area by more strong groups like the Apache, despite the fact that they had a nomadic lifestyle and were located adjacent to the most precious food source in all of North America. They became the most powerful indigenous people in the Americas in the 1500s. But their society turned violent and vindictive due to a single event triggered by their greatest enemy. The Europeans, inspired by the Spanish conquest of Mexico, conquest being something of a specialty for them, progressively expanded their colonies and spheres of influence northward, eventually reaching Apache territory. Around 1600, the Spanish were sent to conquer the area that is now New Mexico. They arrived with metal armor weapons and hundreds of horses. Many indigenous communities in the area were quickly conquered by their superior numbers and weapons. As they had done a century earlier in Central and South America, the Spanish coerced the locals to convert to Christianity and work for them in exchange for food and other goods. The adjacent Apache were less cooperative. When the Apache saw these new Spanish settlements, they reacted violently, snatching horses. They learned to ride horses by observing the Spanish from a distance. The Apache began using mounted raids in the 1650s. The horses' increased speed made it even more of a threat. The relentless persecution was too much for the Spanish settlers in the area. As subjects of the Spanish, the Pueblo Indians, whom the Spanish had captured, expected protection from the Apache terror, but received none. The Spanish settlements of Taos and Santa Fe were frequent targets. The anger would pass swiftly, but the consequences were severe. The Apache would slaughter their enemies before dispersing into the western wilderness with thousands of horses and other goods. The Pueblo people rebelled against the Spanish in 1680 because the Apache violence had gotten so bad. Although they were successful in expelling the Spanish from New Mexico, 1,000 horses of a breed well adapted to the Great Plains made their way north. We now jump ahead several decades. The Apache's behavior shifted in 1706, despite the fact that they had repeatedly raided the Spanish after losing and regaining land. The Spanish noticed the end of attacks on them almost immediately. The Spanish were reportedly at a loss to understand the Apache's odd behavior. The Spanish had heard reports of enormous battles, but they had no idea who the Apache were fighting. Bands like the Jayjas and the Mescaleros appear to be departing the plains, abandoning their villages and fields. Stories circulated of powerful, swift, and frightening northern invaders riding horses. Many Apache bands fled to the highlands or sought refuge with the Spanish by the 1720s because they were so weak. Some groups never even got to that point. Plain-dwelling Apache bands like the Farones, Carlanes, and Palomas were found to be completely wiped out by an enemy that Spanish missions couldn't even identify. The UTEs provided the solution. They named the phantom invaders from the North Comanche, which meant those who are always against me in their language. This was an apt name for the people the Spanish would later refer to as the Comanche. The Apache brought down their own empire by allying with the Comanche. The Comanche have a relatively unremarkable historical reputation. Comanches will never forget how the other tribes in the area bullied them into moving to the less desirable eastern side of the Rockies, where they struggled to survive until the middle of the 17th century, when, by some stroke of divine providence, they discovered the horse. The same horses that had been freed as a result of Apache harassment of the Pueblo in Spanish, and everything changed for them. The Comanche perfected their use of them, and soon all the nearby tribes adopted them. The first noticeable change was that they figured out how to breed horses. The other tribes didn't care. They simply raided them for horses, certainly not the Comanche. They had their own with them on the plains. The Comanche were wealthy because horses were their currency. Like many other plains peoples, the Eastern Apache practiced at least some form of agriculture. It was this that bound them to the earth. The Comanche didn't engage in farming since nomads could live just about anywhere on the plains thanks to the mobility provided by horses. The Comanche posed a threat to anyone within 400 miles of them. This mobility was invaluable when hunting buffalo, but it made them into formidable foes when they took up arms. The Comanche often conducted their raids in the spring and summer when the grass on the plains was plentiful. The full moon provided them with visibility to both assault and flee the raids, which consisted of terrible killings, tortures, and other atrocities that I would rather not discuss in detail on YouTube. The settlers even had a name for this phenomenon, the Comanche Moon. However, their biggest advantage was that they battled while mounted on their horses when nearly no other tribe did. The artist George Catlin observed the Comanche in person and wrote, "They are one of the most unattractive and slovenly-looking races of Indians I've ever seen. However, when the Comanche get on their horses, they seem to be transformed instantly. The Comanches are, without a shadow of a doubt, the finest horsemen I have ever encountered in my extensive travels. They learn to ride and accurately shoot a bow at enemies or buffalo. They would hang off the sides of the beast for protection and fire lethally accurate shots from under the neck. The Apache, who used horses for transportation but fought on foot, could hold their own with anyone and were every bit as vicious as the Comanche. Without their horses, the Comanche might have been easier to catch, but they relied so heavily on them that tracking them down was next to impossible, especially since they rarely stopped in the same spot again when on the move. Not so with the Apache. They were predictable due to agriculture, and their warfare methods were antiquated. According to T.R. Fahrenbach's Comanches, A History of a People, it was the Comanches' very taste for corn that ultimately led to their demise when their homeland was attacked by genuine barbarians on horseback. The Comanche were even more of a threat to the Apache than the Apache were to the Spanish, but the Comanche weren't out to wipe them out. They wanted resources, most notably the buffalo's traditional habitat. As I said before, the Comanche were notoriously violent and vindictive because they never forgot how they were treated while they were helpless. The Comanche's stated goal was to surprise the Apache at the rancherias, kill as many as they could, capture some women and children for the slave trade in New Mexico, plunder the rancherias, and destroy the Hudson crops, as stated by Thomas Britton in his book Light Pan and Patches. The brutality of the fight between these two great forces is attested to by the fact that all Comanches everywhere became enemies of all Apaches. But the war itself has been lost to history, and even the Spanish only watched it from a distance. By the 1720s, the Mescaleros and Jay guerrillas had already evacuated the plains, leaving just the Light Pan. El Gran Sierra del Ferrero seems to be the name of a strange war that broke out around 1723. For multiple days, the Comanche launched a huge assault against the Light Pan. There were a lot of Light Pan warrior casualties, but the Comanche also took a lot of women and kids. With the Comanche to the north and the Spanish to the south, the Lipan were forced to seek refuge in the mountains and deserts. However, in 1749, a strange thing happened. The Apache rode into San Antonio seeking a peace treaty with the Spanish. The Spanish were delighted, as the Apache had been fighting against them since the city was founded in 1719. The Comanche drove them out of their region, which may have contributed to the spike in raids. More food and supplies were available to them on the plains than in the mountains and deserts they had previously traversed. In exchange for peace, the Apache hoped the Spanish would establish a Christian mission and presidio on their land. Priests who had been hesitant to do this before now jumped at the chance. It took a few years to get approved, but if they did, it would help with a lot of problems the Spanish have been having. They might finally put an end to Apache raids and convert them to Catholicism, saving their souls in the process. Gold and silver reserves were rumored to exist in the area, but I highly doubt that factored into their final decision. San Saba was chosen as the site for both the mission and the presidio after much exploration. A wealthy Spaniard was able to get his hands on enough money to do anything he pleased. In exchange for his financial support, his brother's father, Alonso Geraldo de Toreros, would administer the mission, and an able and experienced Spanish officer, Don Diego Ortiz de Parilla, would be in charge. In April 1757, the Spanish assembled their supplies, which included a few priests, 100 soldiers, and perhaps 2,000 animals for the endeavor. When the group finally made it to San Saba, they discovered that the Apache had also vanished. A massive wooden barrier separated the mission from the Presidio, which was about 2 miles apart. The Spanish were getting increasingly irritated by the constant visits from the Apache, who would occasionally ask for gifts and pledge to move to the mission. The Apache may have merely desired gifts all along, according to some of the priests. This is all a ruse, but not a charitable one. In March, the Spanish found out that the Apache had led them there in an attempt to ignite a conflict with the Comanche, as San Saba was not part of Apachea, but rather Comanche territory. The Apache had been making raids against the Comanche up in the north. When the Apache were up north, they would rile up the Comanche by spreading stories that they had erected a fort in San Saba. When the Apache got angry, they'd leave things like Spanish equipment and shoes in their camps, prompting the Spanish to mistake them for allies. In early March of 1758, when the spring grasses were just starting to bloom and the full moon was shining brightly over the plains, the Spanish noticed that there were no longer any Apache in the area near San Saba. War whoops could be heard from outside the walls as dawn broke. They were missing almost 60 horses. 15 troops were dispatched on a reconnaissance mission, and they returned quickly, reporting that the hills were teeming with enemy forces. The Comanche took their time, lying hidden for nearly 2 weeks. The Presidio barricaded itself. Few ventured outside the fortified perimeter. On March 16th, the Comanche showed up at the gates of both the mission and the Presidio, miles apart, while the Spanish peered over the walls of their palisade. Toreros and around 30 men stayed at the mission. According to Fahrenbach, everything they saw left them speechless. The savages' plains and major Indian leaders were magnificent displays of the complete panoply of war's barbarism. The riders' faces were painted red and black, the color of death, and they wore spectacular headdresses made of feathers, deer antlers, and bison horns. Every single one of those guys had a bow, lance, or spear. At the mission, many of the men had brand new muskets. After the Comanche pretended to be friendly, the priest let them in. Several additional native tribes, including several with whom the Spanish had cooperatively worked in the past, joined the Comanche. The Spanish sought to soothe the inhabitants once they were inside the gates by presenting them with presents, but the situation quickly escalated into a massacre. Although I have read varying estimates, I believe that between 8 and 10 people, including Father Toreros, were slaughtered by the Comanche inside the mission. When they weren't plundering, they were torching buildings and mutilating corpses. The Comanche probably let more things get away to the safer Presidio because they were more interested in looting than chasing after the fleeing missionaries who posed little threat to them. Perilla attempted to send reinforcements, but they were met with fierce resistance and were eventually forced to turn back. The Comanche never even attacked the Presidio. They wouldn't. They were smart. They had the advantage against the mission. And they'd made their point 2 days later, just as quickly as they'd appeared. The massacre got worse for the Spanish the following year in 1759, when they sent out a punitive expedition meant as retaliation against the Comanche and led by Perilla. The Spanish were shocked, but at least they started out rather well organized. The Indian allies and the 130 Apache with them were aware of the Comanche's capabilities and were not eager for a confrontation. Although Perla did her best to keep the expedition together, several members left as soon as the combat began, resulting in a full-scale retreat with hardly any fighting having taken place. Their materials, including cannons, were abandoned, turning what was supposed to be a display of force into a major embarrassment. The Apache's strategy to use the Spanish as a shield against the Comanche had backfired. Unfortunately for the Apache, things are only going to get worse, as it appeared that the Spanish were helpless against them as well. After only a few months in the south, the Comanche were launching regular raids on the Spanish frontier. The Spanish colonists dispersed throughout the dry land. For the Comanches, it served as a major thoroughfare. The true fear that they perceived from the savagery of the time is captured by SC, and it was simple for them to avoid forts. Trails carved out men burned alive. They skewered infants and took young boys and girls captive. Then they used the speed of the Spanish Mustangs to get away, leaving the elaborately equipped dragoo behind. This is a direct quote from Gwen's book, Empire of the Summer Moon. They never attacked an armed fort. They relished surprise and insisted on tactical advantage. They would attack whole villages and burn them, torturing and killing their inhabitants, leaving young women with their ends. Both the Spanish and the Apache had trouble dealing with the Comanche, and the Spanish occasionally sent punitive expeditions after the Comanche. Some of these expeditions returned empty-handed and others never returned at all. Whether these losses were the result of the Comanche or the harsh plan's geography will likely never be known. They needed extra supplies since they had been unable to produce since the Comanche had driven them off the plains. From San Antonio in 1780, Texas Governor Domingo Cabello wrote, "There is no instant day or night when the reports of barbarities and disorders do not arrive from the ranches totally unprotected as we are. This can only result in the complete destruction and loss of this province." They had never before experienced a war of extermination. They were under simultaneous attack from two major powers that were bitter enemies. It was a factor the Spanish sought to exploit. The Spanish had a hard time even reaching out to the Comanche until roughly 1780. But things turned around after an officer named Don Juan Batista de Anza established his authority. He led a group into Comancheria, employing the same horseback tactics the Comanche were famous for. He was successful in wiping out a band that had ambushed them near Greenhorn Peak. There was definitely some hubris involved on the part of the Comanche. They were not impressed with the Spanish fighting ability up until this point, and it seems they did not take them as seriously as they should have. Anza followed up his success with more attacks, and subsequent years after his attacks, he would release those that he had captured with a message that the Comanche could have peace and trade whenever they wanted it. By 1785, the Comanche losses were not great but serious enough that they were ready to meet. Several bands sent representatives to a meeting in Taos and in a work of magic by Anta. He got them to agree to let one person speak for them. At the end of the meeting, they agreed to three things. 1, the Comanche would stop attacking the Spanish. 2, trade would open up between the Spanish and the Comanche. And 3, the Comanche would help the Spanish destroy the Apache. The Spanish achieved a significant victory because not only did hostilities with the Comanche cease, but they also agreed to hunt down and destroy their oldest foe in the area, band by band. The best example of these Spanish-Comanche campaigns comes from January 1790, when Spanish General Juan de Ugalde led a powerful horde of Spanish-Comanche in Wichita against the Lipan Apache. Hundreds of warriors were trapped in a canyon west of San Antonio and slaughtered after their defeat. The Lipan Apache were left with less than 1,000 warriors in total. The tribe, like the rest, abandoned whatever land they had left on the fringes of Comancheria and retreated entirely into the mountains again for good. As the most powerful tribe in North America, the Comanche had completed their claim for the plains, and the Spanish, for a time, no longer had to consider the Apache a serious threat to their settlements. The peace between the Spanish and Comanche held for decades, but the Apache are resilient on the plains. The Comanches were victorious, but the rugged nature of the mountains made the horses less of an advantage there, and in that environment the Apache could resist successfully. In that way, both the American civilizations of the Spanish and the Comanche would fall before them. But those are stories for another day. The video is over. Thanks for watching. I'd love it if you'd check out some of my other videos on the channel if this one was any good. Please give us your feedback, suggestions, and comments for future films, and we'll do our best to address all of your non-English questions and remarks.